Hello and welcome to Atypical the podcast where we look at life from a more atypical perspective. My name's Simon, he there, your host, and I'm joined by
Sam, he, him.
It's lovely to have you with me this evening. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very toasty and cozy.
Oh, that's always good. I'm going to have to apologise for listeners now. I lost my voice this week, and it's mostly come back.
I'd forgotten you'd lost your voice.
Because it was all peaceful. I'm relatively certain lots of people in my workplace and in my life were like, "Oh my God, Simon's not talking. At last, we can get a word in edgeways." I certainly know that one of my engineers did send me a message going, "It's awfully quiet today," and followed up by, "Oh yes, you've lost your voice, haven't you? Ha ha! Like you bastard. I know where you sit." So yes, so this podcast is not only going to be a day or two late for you listeners, but hopefully, even through the power of editing, I shouldn't be sounding too bad. He says, hopefully. No, so thank you for joining me, Sam. The thing we wanted to talk about this week was kind of two things that have been happening this week. There's Trans Awareness Week, which also has, obviously on Monday, Trans Day of Remembrance. But on the 16th, which on the day of recording was yesterday, day before, I'm losing track already, is the start of Disability History Month. But we'll talk a bit more about that later. First of all, we're going to talk about trans awareness, because I think most people are probably aware that it's kind of been in the news and media. There's quite a lot of stuff about trans people.
I think that's very fair to say.
Yeah,
it's difficult to not have a bit of an opinion on it.
Yeah,
which is, I think when you're sort of making a podcast, it's you almost don't want to sort of start throwing your opinion around with too much weight. It becomes a lot more conscious of something that you start thinking about. But yes,
I think in this case, we are a pro-trans podcast. 100%. Trans rights are human rights, and
1,000%.
I'm going to say, from my point of view, if you treat a trans person with anything less than respect because of their identity, that's no different to being racist or homophobic or misogynistic.
Yeah, exactly. It is discrimination.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not trans, but I have friends, I have loved ones who are. Yeah. I'm fairly certain at least some of our listeners will have people in their lives or people they know who are. Whether or not they know it at the time is, but just because we're not, Sam, there's things we can do, right?
Yeah, and like I want to echo like what you're saying there as well. Like I strongly advocate for trans rights, and I think it is absolutely disgusting and abhorrent the way they are being weaponized by people in positions of power across the world to divide people. And let's face it, that's what is happening with them. I think personally, I think there's probably people that do have issue with them for whatever reason their personal issues may be, or their views one way or another. But ultimately, it's causing division between people, and like I just think like we're all human at the end of the day.
Yes, absolutely.
Why can't we just leave it at that? Does it matter? Does anything matter any further than that? You're human. Great. Okay. Let's crack on.
No, 100%. One of the things which I've been sort of learning about myself on my own sort of explorations, I suppose, of sort of gender identity, sort of borderline non-binary sort of spectrum, I suppose, for me. But one of the things that is a really useful thing to be is an ally. And, that's someone who obviously supports but is not necessarily part of that community, where you seek to ensure that your fellow human beings are treated fairly and with respect. And I guess something you've just talked about there is about taking that sort of positive action to show support and sort of speak up for when there's, you see discrimination, when you see injustice happening.
Yeah, definitely. And like it's very easy to sit on the sidelines in any situation and not say anything because it's not something you want to engage with, or there's genuine reasons there. If you're not capable, you don't have the mental health base free access of resources, it were, to sort of take that on, then it's not a position that you should be trying to take on, because it's important you look after your own sort of mental health first. But if you have that spare capacity to do something and stand up and I like to sort of put it in the scenario that you sort of put your head above the parapet and say, no, that's not okay. I don't agree with that. And that's what the fundamentals about being what an ally is. It's sort of like being prepared to stand up for people that are marginalized, that are in the greater community. They have a smaller voice because there is less of them, and
Yeah,
we
absolutely.
need the allies, the supporters from the greater community to stand up for the people that don't have a big voice themselves, to stand up and challenge the people that are sort of throwing hate around and throwing misinformation around, and help challenge it, because without that we wouldn't be where we are today with equality rights, and that goes for, it doesn't just go for LGBT communities,
No,
it applies
goes
to
for
the Black, Asian, ethnic minorities. It applies to women. And it's as far back as you go. It applies.
Yeah.
It goes back even further, like to the general workforce. There was a time at which people were basically slaves, and they stood up for themselves and said, "Enough's enough," and it started a movement. And I always think it's a shame when we sort of start dividing ourselves again by resegregating ourselves and creating these divisions between people just because somebody's had the courage to stand out and say, "This is
live
me."
their authentic selves.
Yeah, and that's awful.
Absolutely.
Why? Anyway,
I think you're absolutely right.
we're
Some of the
tangenting
things
already.
Well, we are a tangential podcast, aren't we?
Well,
Tangential,
pro-tangent.
Yeah. Pro-tangent, yes, we do love our tangents. But no, I think you've touched on so many good things there, and part of being an ally is also going to be a little bit about challenging your own misconceptions. I think.
Yeah, being open to learning, that is a
precisely
massive thing.
That natural part of being a positive change in the world is about breaking down those barriers and even internal stigmas, I guess.
Yeah. Be open to being wrong, and saying that. Oh,
okay. Just a quick point there. I'm never wrong. I just haven't quite learned all of it yet.
Yeah, well, it's very rare. I mentioned to somebody the other day, I think that it may very well have been today, quite honestly.
I did, yeah, I know.
All of the days are merging into one at the moment. No, I mentioned earlier and I mentioned yourself, not by name, but I reference you a lot nowadays.
So it's terrifying.
I think I've only actually mentioned 2 or possibly 3 things to you that you have then gone, "Oh, I didn't know that." And every time it's a massive win. It's like, yes, he doesn't know something. Yeah, well, because it always astounds me, like the way your mind works. It really does.
Autism is a condition characterized by.
It's beautiful. I think it's beautiful, and I don't think
thank you.
It's anything less.
Anyway, again, tangents. Should we talk about some of the things that we have learned over the years, but what makes being a good ally to not just to anything, but I think specifically around being a trans and non-binary ally.
We hit the first one there. We hit off with the first one there. I think with learning and being open to learning, and, adapting and changing as we learn as well. Because I think we have learned more in the past couple of years, and people have learned more about themselves and what it means to be human and that spectrum. So, being open to just accepting people. And I think humility for me as well is something that can be very useful. Like if you get pronouns wrong, for example, because that's part of being a good ally as well, is using the pronouns. But if you get them wrong, and you might not realize, but if someone says, "Oh, that's not my pronouns," then obviously just apologize and say, "Oh, sorry, I just mispronounced you," or please forgive me. I'm still trying to get there, but I'm more than welcome and open to a nudge here and there, because it is something that I'm still being very new to. So being honest about where you are in your journey of sort of finding yourself. I would still 100% say I'm on that journey, and it's something I'm probably more conscious of generally. But it's.
I think being open to that is absolutely the right first step. I think it's quite nice that you sort of definitely touched immediately on the pronoun thing, because I think it's probably the easiest and simplest way of showing support, right? Using someone's correct pronouns is just one of the most important ways you can just show respect, and it's really simple and easy to do.
It's easy, isn't it? Yeah, it really is.
You know, I feel like we should just quickly clarify what we mean by this. So, I mean, obviously, pronouns are the words we use to refer to people: he, him, she, her, they, them, etc.
Yeah.
And certainly in the Western world and in some of the other countries I've lived in around the world, I guess we're kind of slightly conditioned to make assumptions about pronouns based on the way someone looks or presents themselves. But obviously, you know, we have to say right out there, someone's appearance doesn't necessarily reflect their gender identity, their sexual identity, their belief system, whatever it may be. And something which I try and do, and is something I try and tell like colleagues and friends and stuff, is just when you introduce yourself to someone, just include your own pronouns. We did it at the beginning of this podcast. It's something that we just do. And it becomes to the point where I don't actually realize I'm saying it. Whenever I meet someone new or I go into something, I go, hi, I'm Simon, he, they. And it's part and parcel of me introducing myself.
Yeah.
And it means, you know, that's fine. And you're absolutely right. You know, if you get someone's pronoun, first of all, there's nothing wrong with saying, hey, what pronoun do you use? Because I want to get it right. I want to show respect to you. Most people are going to be, you know, certainly most trans and non-binary people are completely normal and okay with that question because they'd rather you get it right. But like you said, if you slip up, just apologize, move on.
Yes.
Like I have seen people react slightly strongly to it, and it makes the whole thing overblown, and it's not worth it. Just a quick, oh, I'm really sorry. It shows then at least you're trying to respect them. There's no need to sort of do a Shakespearean monologue, which is
no, and
probably what goes through my brain anyway. Every time I get something wrong, I sort of stand there going, "Oh, all different ways I need to apologise," because I'm not known for apologising. Let's be honest here.
Yeah.
But no, simply calling someone by the right pronoun, it might feel slightly odd at first if you're not used to it, but with practice, it becomes completely normal. And it could really mean the world to someone to have their identity recognised.
Yes, I totally agree. And I would like to sort of mention two things probably.
Please.
There. I think the one that people most get confused or don't quite understand yet, I think is being honest, is the they them one, because people do associate it very much with multiple people, you know, plural. And I think that's the one that people sort of struggle with more than anything. But it's okay. You know, I think we've got to say it's okay if you're honest and just say, you know, it's just something that I'm still trying to train myself to understand better and get out of the mindset of. It's an easy one to trip up with, that one, I think. But again, it comes back to that sort of humility and just being honest and saying that you are trying, you know, but if you get it wrong, then please correct me.
It's an interesting one because it's something which I ended up looking into, and the singular they. I know. The OED has traced the singular they back to 1375, which means that it's an older usage than he or she.
Yeah,
which is interesting. So yes, singular they is absolutely. I mean, that predates the Great Vowel Shift. It is English. It is older than America by some centuries. So I get where you're coming from. It's just because we have slightly fallen out of use for it in the last little while, it might just be a hard one to come back to.
Yeah. The second part that I would like to also mention is that it's the little things as well. So if you don't quite feel comfortable maybe at this point, if you want to be like a better ally, particularly towards trans people, and you're not sure you're quite comfortable sort of announcing, you know, my name is Sam and my pronouns are he, him, because it doesn't quite feel natural enough to you yet, that is okay.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
What I would personally try, or suggest you try, is get yourself a little pin badge.
Yes.
Because people will see that, they'll ask you what it means, and you can then sort of engage with them a little bit on it. But more importantly than that is that people from the trans community, from non-binary communities that identify with different pronouns will see that, and immediately they will be able to connect that to you understanding that you're saying pronouns are something I understand and value and respect. And it's it's the little signs like that mean the world to communities that
are somewhat marginalised.
Are somewhat marginalised, or you're not part of. You know, like when I see, it's silly, but like when I see somebody with a rainbow lanyard on at work, it makes me feel a little bit better. You know, I know that I've got people that are willing to support.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
So, yeah, just something to think about?
Well, I think sort of moving on from that is just straightforward inclusive language and using sort of gender neutral language in your day to day, writing and so forth. And that's especially, and I mean, that's more in the workplace perhaps, but it's something just to sort of think about. And I know that many languages other than English do employ gendered nouns. So in German, for example, has 3 of them because it has the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter. Spanish and French have masculine and feminine nouns and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they are they're nothing to do with gender. It's just the way in which these things have evolved over time. But we're not here to discuss interesting languages there. I'm just saying, if you are writing stuff, just use more gender neutral terminology if you can.
Yes.
What else is there? That's fine.
Sorry.
So confidentiality. I was just going to say, it's like when someone discloses something about themselves, that's a mark of trust, right? And if they're sharing about their gender identity or their disability or their sexuality or religious beliefs, they're sharing something personal with you, and sharing that without their explicit permission is not just disrespectful. It might even be potentially illegal depending on where you are and what it's about. But it's just really, really unfair. So if someone does share something with you in confidence, respect that and support them.
Yeah, definitely. And like, as with any piece of information about somebody that you have, you should check with that person before disclosing it. You might find yourself in a situation where you feel it could potentially be important to disclose the piece of information, but that still should be something that you check with the person before 100%. Disclosing.
It's respecting those boundaries and knowing what you can and can't follow up on as well. Because if they've disclosed something to you, it is important to avoid personal questions that might be intrusive, right?
Yes. And immediately leading on from that, I think it's very important to mention dead naming.
Yeah.
Because that was something that I learned about and didn't. I hope that
do you want to explain what dead naming is?
Yes. So dead naming is where you ask or use a trans person's previous name or original name, should we say? Is that correct? Is that correct terminology?
The name they may have been given.
Yeah, the name they might have been assigned at birth or, by their parents, but they've moved on from.
Yes.
And for some people, it might be something that they offer freely, or if you get to a position where you are close enough, and you might get to eventually a position that you can have that conversation with that person. It should never be something that you sort of actively seek out because it is very personal. It can potentially be very traumatic for that individual because it could 100%. Be associated with a lot of negativity in their life that they may very well have moved past or may still be dealing with. So it is really important that you don't ask. If the information is offered, great. And again, that leads back to that confidentiality thing. Just because you've been offered it doesn't mean that then it is free and open information to distribute.
Absolutely. And again, I think just with the dead naming thing, if someone says to you, my name is, just use that name.
Yeah, it ain't going to kill you.
And if you are a trans person, that name is very important to you. It's how you identify. It's who you are. So if they ask to be called that, just call them that.
Yep, totally. Because it doesn't cost you anything.
Nope. But it could mean the world to them. I don't think it's really a huge amount of effort just to use someone's name.
What else? What have we not covered? So speaking up against discrimination, I think.
Oh, that's a good point. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, it almost goes, or it feels like it should go without saying, doesn't it? Really, that you need to be prepared to stand up, to speak up against discrimination, and say that's not okay. I think we mentioned it at the very start of the podcast. Sticking your head above that parapet and saying, no, that's not okay, and I won't allow you to perpetrate that negativity. Is that a thing? Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me.
Spreading negativity in any form it's not productive to anybody, really. It doesn't move us forward as a society or, as a community or anything like that. All it does is divide people, and individuals benefit from that. We as a society do not benefit from dividing people. We've
Oh,
we've
no,
lost
no.
we've lost our way a long while ago, where we've been led into this belief that the human race is designed to be the survival of the fittest, and it's not true. If you go back to sort of the dawn, and I'm proper tangenting here from discrimination, but if we go back to like the when we first started to develop agriculture, that was so that communities thrived. You know, people literally came to get together to improve everybody's life, because it was better for society to work together and,
Yeah.
play to each other's advantages and skills that they had and specialize. And that's what happened. But somewhere along from that point to where we are now, we got told that actually it should be more everyone for themselves. And it creates situations all the time that try and divide us. And the problem is they get more and more clever as we sort of evolve as a society, I guess. And they have to those mechanisms that are used to divide us get smarter or more subtle and
Yes.
a bit more sneaky, maybe. But they also, I think, come with the same level of fire behind them, because people are very good at fanning that fire to sort of create situations where it divides us. So it's really important to stand up, because when to bring it back round now, when you do see that discrimination happen, and you stand up and say, no, that's not okay to say that, or that enough of that doesn't help, it immediately, people 9 times out of 10 will go, "Ooh," and you catch them off guard, because they don't expect
they're not expecting
people.
it.
Yeah, they don't expect people to stand up and say that's not okay. And the moment they do, like I say, 9 times out of 10, you get the response of that person backs off very rapidly, because they realize what they're doing is wrong. They know in the core of their being what they're saying or doing, whatever it may be, is wrong, and
Yes,
it's
absolutely.
not okay, because they've been challenged, and that is generally enough. You might come across a situation where you get a bit of pushback, but at that point, you've got to sort of evaluate or make sure you keep your own safety in mind, because there's no point putting yourself in a position where you're in danger just to make sure. I think if you are challenging that discrimination, you're not doing it or you're managing the risk, should we say?
Yes.
Manage the risk. Yes, because it's not always safe. And I think
no, unfortunately not. And no matter how unsafe it might be for you and I, it's a lot worse for our trans friends and siblings.
Yes, totally. Which is why they need allies. Which is why they need more support. I believe my workplace is currently developing trans champions. Because,
good.
Yes, it's recognising that they need extra support. And unfortunately, I'm going to have to go to crumble check again.
Go do crumble check.
Bear with.
So yes, I think being an ally is really important. And like I say, we'll put a bunch of stuff into the show notes to help you to read up more on it.
Oh yes, so these notes will be very good to share. Share the notes.
I try. But I think lastly, we should also mention that Monday, the 20th of November, is Trans Day of Remembrance. And it's a day when we remember and unfortunately mourn the deaths of trans people in the UK and around the world who have been murdered or had their lives shortened due to transphobic violence. It started in 1999. Gwendolyn Smith started it as a vigil to honour the memory of her friend Rita Hester, who was a black transgender woman who was killed in her Boston home in 1998. I will also link a news article to that in the show notes. There's a trigger warning attached to that, obviously. But there are events across the UK, the US, and lots of other countries. And if you can make the time, I think on Monday, attending one of these to show your support and allyship for the community will absolutely be appreciated.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's very good to sort of have these days and try and educate yourself a little bit. It's certainly something that I want to do a little bit more. Educate myself around these a little bit more, because I think when we choose to ignore history, it's sort of, you have that risk of repeating those events if we don't learn from them and continue to learn. as well. So it is very important.
Yeah, absolutely. Shall we talk about the other thing that we were going to talk about for this podcast, which is, of course, Disability History Month? And I should very much make clear as part of this transition, being trans is not a disability. It is not a mental health condition. It is an identity, and there's lots of much better people talk about this than me, but they are not the same thing. However, disability is important. And, it's kind of one of the core things we talk about on this podcast because, autism and ADHD, most neurodiversities do sit under that disability banner. So Disability History Month, like I said at the start of the podcast, it's also the start of Disability History Month. This year, there's a focus on childhood and youth. I realise that I'm quite a long way from childhood and I'm not that youthful anymore.
I don't know.
Well, yes, this is true. I get away with 20-something when I need to. So, but it has been something of a difficult road for their words. I'm chewing on a throat sweet, and I'm struggling to speak.
Finish your sweetie first, then. Don't try, because you'll end up choking yourself. On a tangent. No,
yes, tangent.
I think it's. I don't think it's a terrible thing at all. I just think it's an interesting observation that I think at some point we might find ourselves running out of days and months, and we're going to end up in a situation of ever overlapping events because there's only so many days in a year.
There
are
a
lot of them are
there
taken.
Are some days which have nothing on them at all. It's very bizarre.
Yeah. I think at some point, it's just interesting, isn't it? And like, not everybody can have a week for things and whatnot, can we? It's gonna end up being a lot at some point, potentially. Just an interesting observation.
It is
no shade intended.
No, but yeah. So Disability History Month it starts on the 16th of November, and as many disabled people listening will know, it can be something of a difficult road being disabled and a young person. I'm feeling quite disabled by the fact that I can't speak very well at the moment.
Understandable.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not as bad as when I had the really awful stutter, which I sort of grew up with.
But it's something you do a lot as well. So
stutter, yes, I know.
No, talking.
Well, yeah, I know. This is why people are very pleased I lost my voice. It made me shut up for once.
Do we know why Disability History Month starts in the middle of the month? Because that's flagging to me as bizarre. I'm not going to lie. And I'm just wondering, does it run into December?
It does, yeah. It runs 16th of November, 16th December.
Oh, that's interesting. I wonder if there's a reason for that.
As for why the 16th, I actually don't know.
No, it was just a thought then. I thought, why the 16th? Why are we starting a month of something in the middle of a month?
It's not clear why the 16th.
Okay. The 16th. Well, there we go. We can call on any listeners. Should you be aware of why Disability History Month starts in the middle of the month, please get in touch. Let us know.
I haven't got a clue.
Because I would be interested to know. There might not be a reason. It might just be because.
Just because.
Anyway.
But yes. Anyway, so it's, like I say, it's Disability History Month. And what I find interesting is that even after sort of years of advocacy and progress, people are still being sort of left out. And we still find that support is falling short for a lot of people. There's no question in my mind, certainly, that prejudice and barriers absolutely still exist.
Yeah.
But also, and caution here, I'm about to do some info dumping because I did some reading, because when would I not? I do think that things have come quite a long way as well. I mean, there was, a huge amount of cruelty and isolation in the past, and a lot of that has largely been overturned. Medicine and welfare have come along, and so, conditions that dominated life in the 1800s and 1900s have started to fall away. So people have more agency and ability to exist, even if they are disabled. We've moved from the sort of the charitable and the medical model to now looking at the more social and human rights model. We're going to have to do an episode on the models of disability sometime, I think, Sam, because it's fascinating.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because we do live in a disabling society, and if we lived in a better equipped society to enable disabled people to live in a position of equality with their peers, then they wouldn't be so much seen as disabled, because there wouldn't be any issues, for them. They would be able to achieve the same goals as somebody that wasn't disabled.
Well, absolutely so. But I think the whole sort of, for want of a better term, disabled people's movement has been quite instrumental in pushing society to adopt this more social model of responsibility, where, like you say, putting that focus not on an individual's diagnosis and issues, but more on the barriers created by the environment, by attitudes, by communications and access, and even just organizations. There's the UN's Declaration on Disability Rights in 2006 was probably the biggest single milestone internationally, sort of enshrining access and inclusion as a human right.
Yeah.
Here in the UK, in 2010, we had the Equality Act, which obviously brings together dozens of pieces of legislation, sort of with the aim of recognising those protected characteristics. I mean, you've recently done a course that covers on sort of inclusion and equality, haven't you?
I've done 2.
Oh. So what have you learned about the Equality Act? Come on, tell us interesting things.
Oh, God. No, it's for the listener, we are recording this at 20 to midnight, and I'm now being tested.
Yes.
On my day off, I might add.
I went to work today, so...
Yes. What did I learn about the Equality Act? I learned a lot. Probably more than we have time to sort of cover off in here.
Probably.
But I learned about the 9 protected characteristics, and there was a 10th one drafted, but it got removed. So that's another issue entirely that we won't touch on now, because we'll be here until the early hours.
Yes, we'll probably do something on the evolution of that at some point, because it was an interesting thing.
But yeah, like Simon says, it was an amalgamation, a bringing together of many pieces of legislation and it firmly cemented those in law and sort of helped bring them together, include more people in it as well, so that people were protected from discrimination by certain protected characteristics.
Yes, absolutely.
So that, you can't be treated unfairly in the workplace
because of part of your identity. Yeah.
Because of your identity. Yeah. And it's once you understand it and sort of know about it, it can be a very powerful piece of legislation. Advocate for good, and improving standards. That and the Health and Safety at Work Act together combined are quite
pretty powerful things.
Powerful bits of legislation, to affect change if you know how to use them.
And I think, unfortunately, you're right. To a certain extent, implementation has been a bit slow of these things, and that sort of those economic and social disadvantages are still really far too common. But there's a foundation there now, right? There's a place we can build from to start advocating for those rights and dignity and agency for everybody. Yeah,
and we recently as well we had an update to the flexible working in the UK. So it's become a day one right that you can request flexible working, which goes hand in hand with equality. So that's quite good that you now have that ability to, because it didn't used to be a day one right of employment that
you used to have to earn it.
You could request flexibility, whether that might be to support your children or you have issues being in the car for long periods of time commuting to work, and there's no reason why you can't do your job 3 days out of 5 remotely,
or 3 days out of precisely. It's a good start.
Yeah.
So Disability Month this month is focusing, like I say, on youth and childhood. So I thought it might be good to talk a little bit about education and disability. And, frankly, the last 300 years have cast something of a long shadow when it comes to how disabled people, and especially children, have been treated. Yeah. There's been so much ostracization and marginalization, ridiculing and dismissing and all of those kind of words. And it's prevented so many people from achieving their potential and their rights. I've been doing some research for a much longer episode I want to do soon on history of dyslexia, and sort of some of this is really starting to come out for me. Sorry, I interrupted you. Go ahead.
Yeah, so, I was just going to mention, because you mentioned sort of that this month is about, what did you say? The
youth and childhood and stuff.
Youth and childhood, thank you. Youth and childhood. Youth and childhood, innit? Yes, so I think it's important in that especially after having touched on the Equality Act, to remember that you are protected under the Equality Act as well with like disability by association. So if you are a carer of somebody who has a disability, that legislation extends to you as well, and applies if should you be in a position where you're working sort of full time and need to arrange flexible working. Your employer can't refuse that if it's because you need flexibility to care for somebody. Your child has a disability and you need to take them to medical appointments to sort of try new medication. It could be, I don't know, a multitude of therapies. The list is almost endless. But yeah, it's important to remember that everybody has protected characteristics, and people quite often underestimate what applies to them. So it's always worth sort of maybe asking somebody if you don't. If you're in your union, go and ask your union.
Absolutely, join a union.
Yeah, pro-union.
We're pro-union. Talking of unions, in pre-industrial times, before we had unions, child labour was very common, wasn't it? Kids would be normally working alongside parents on their farms or on crafts or whatever. But by the late 1700s, children were being employed in factories, in mines, as chimney sweeps, or doing sort of quite dangerous work for basically zero pay. And many of them started to acquire lifelong impairments. Some of these conditions were absolutely horrific.
Oh, yeah. We can only imagine.
By the 1830s, I think it is, there are some pretty key reforms starting to come in, and campaigners are comparing like mill workers' treatments to that of slaves. The Factory Act, which was sort of the first health and safety act, which you sort of mentioned there, banned night work for kids, and it started limiting hours, and it stopped under 9-year-olds from working in the mills because they were, ripping off limbs and goodness knows what else. Even by the 1900s, deafness was being seen as like an occupational hazard for weavers because the machines were so loud. They were all going deaf at a very young age.
I remember doing that in history, actually. You reminded me of some of the history now.
Oh, so you did this at school, yeah?
Yeah, we probably... Well, it's obviously...
Industrial Revolution, I suppose.
Yeah. I think that fact somewhere where you said 9 or something, I think that a little bell in the back of my mind went ding. Something obviously got remembered somewhere.
Something soaked in.
Yeah.
But although there was some like local parish support in places for sort of the old, the ill, the infirm, lots of this was sort of tied to land and families and all the rest of it. It was sort of a bit odd, and industrialization caused huge issues and made life pretty damn cruel, but especially for disabled children whose families couldn't support them. And then in 1834, the Poor Law created workhouses, and that came from the idea that only those willing to enter unpleasant conditions deserved help. Yeah, and once you were effectively confined to a workhouse, families would be separated. They would face the kind of like almost prison levels of discipline and hard labor. And yet in just 5 years, more than 350 of these things were created, and more than 200 of them were around by 1900. Charlie Chaplin, he and his family ended up in a workhouse, and it coloured his views and his filmmaking even for the rest of his life.
Incredible. You always amaze me with the amount of information that you gather together. Rather impressive.
That is my disability, autism. Hooray! But life in a workhouse was designed to be worse than if you were a free worker, and the idea behind that was that taxpayers wouldn't be burdened. Yay, capitalism!
Oh, yes. That's another episode.
That's our socialist episode.
Yes,
but this meant that basically it was mostly old people, what they would call the infirm, disabled people, and children going into these workhouses. And by 1860, there were so many disabled people going in there because they had nowhere else to go. No shelter or place. The thing I found when I was reading into this, of course, and people who know more can probably tell me more, but apparently children were separated by age and gender, largely to prevent what one of these documents I read called breeding.
What a lovely term.
It's a lovely term. But soon, lots of these workhouses were housing so many people who were unable to work that they had to start creating special wards and staff to, air quotes, care for the, air quotes, insane and idiot residents. In fact, by 1837, there were over 8,000 people under that kind of care. And when I say care, I think their idea of it would not just shock us today, but would be really quite unpleasant.
Yes, I can very much imagine that the term care is probably quite generous, I think.
Yeah. And the thing is that some people saw workhouse children as sort of innocent because they didn't cause their own poverty, but their presence alongside other paupers, for want of a better word, led to the view that they'd inevitably become thieves or prostitutes or paupers themselves. And so this then led to the introduction of basic schooling being required, although for some reason they decided writing wasn't needed, so they dropped it. So they used to do reading, writing, and arithmetic, to use the Tony Blair for the moment.
It's nothing to do with that term you may have mentioned before, capitalism and keeping the working man down.
Well, yes, indeed. Yeah. So they would do 3 hours of reading and arithmetic in what became known as the ragged schools because they were wearing rags. And that did actually provide better education for poor children than those who weren't living in the workhouse. So there was, some flip arounds on that. In fact, it wasn't until the Foster Education Act of 1870 that everyone got compulsory education at all. Wow. And I think it's quite interesting that, it's something I only really discovered today in the late 1800s, which, were pretty tough on everyone. Infant mortality was horrifically high. Dangerous child labour was taking lots of lives. In London's somewhat overcrowded East End, there was a lot of poverty and disease. And a chap called Thomas Barnardo, people have probably heard of the charity Barnardo's, opened a home for boys at 18 Stepney Causeway in 1870. I was actually talking to a friend of mine today in a Discord channel I'm part of, and she grew up around the corner from there and was giving me all sorts of interesting information about it. But yeah, so poor children were suffering from malnutrition, from curvature of the spine, from respiratory diseases, from syphilis, and various deformities. And Bernardo was welcoming basically anyone, all abilities and health conditions into his care. He actually had a daughter who had Down syndrome, and that may have influenced his sort of like stated disapproval of segregating disabled and non-disabled children. He believed that integration benefited everyone.
Yeah. What would you call him? A visionary of his time. Well,
yeah, I mean, he
in a positive way.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure there was some pros and cons there as well, and who knows what other challenging views he may have held.
Perfect.
But he very much felt that kindness should be shown to all of the boys and girls in their care, and that actually having a maimed, or in his terms here, maimed or seriously deformed child should only really draw out kind deeds and gentle thoughts. Now, we're edging into more the charitable model of disability there, but at least that was probably slightly better than what was going on in some of the workhouses.
Yes, yeah. I'd agree that's definitely a step forward.
Yes. Well, like I say, until 1870 with the Education Act, most children went uneducated anyway, unless they're in the workhouse, in which case they're in those ragged schools. And although there wasn't really any kind of segregation then, I would imagine that a lot of disabled kids were probably neglected, because of those lack of resources or understanding. And those sort of like attitudes of morality and social Darwinism, which probably shaped people's education. I found a woman called Mary Dendy, who was a member of the eugenics movement. And, eugenicists are always such lovely people. She used to refer to them as feeble-minded children. She saw them as such a threat, she thought they shouldn't be allowed to breed. Again, that word. And
it would be interesting to know sort of how the word was used at the time. Because is that I understand.
Well, she's a eugenicist. She didn't want them having children.
Yes. No, sorry. So,
I think it's more a case of, from what I've read of her, she saw these people as not much better than animals.
Yes. So it's being used in a very similar sort of context.
Yeah, she sort of lobbied and agitated and effectively got the government to pass the 1913 Mental Deficiency Act, which allowed them to start opening up institutions to institutionalize people. I mean,
wonderful.
More recent views suggest this came as much from the fear of just the working class people's autonomy as it did from just eugenics. But again, I think we could probably have an entire episode on the philosophy of that, and I would need a lot more time to prepare for it. But she was part of the Manchester School Board, and she was struck by what she called outcast children being unable to access education. And so she pushed for these kind of special day schools and residential institutions. One of them I found was called the Sandalbridge School for the Permanent Care for the Feeble-Minded, which she got like certified, and children would go there, and then they would be sort of progressed onto the Sandalbridge Hospital. Which
she's got a real way with words, this one, hasn't she?
Yes, I say hospital. Prison, I think, is a better term for it. 400 of them, in fact, were still there until 1947 when it was closed down. Because whilst education had become a right for everyone, and indeed we started to see schools for children with disabilities like blindness and deafness, they were often strict, but they did kind of offer a bit more hope and sort of slightly more progressive ideas. There were these things called sunshine homes, which would take care of blind kids. And they had something called open air schools, which were thought to sort of help boost children's health. Although, having been forced to do PE in winter in shorts and a t-shirt, I'm not entirely sure I'd agree with that, but that's another matter entirely. And a lot of kids were trained for more sort of simple jobs, sort of believing that they wouldn't be able to do work at all. In fact, my friend was saying about how her grandfather was basically forced to become a carpenter because they thought he didn't have any real brains, and actually turned out he was very good at it, so it wasn't a major issue. But I also came across Cyril Burt. So I came across this guy when I was writing my notes for the upcoming dyslexia episode. He brought the idea of mass IQ testing. He sat on something called the Spens Committee, where he advocated for the 11 plus and the tripartite system. And if you're an older person in Britain, you'll know what those are. But he was keen to prove a genetic link between low intelligence, poverty, and crime. You'll be unsurprised to hear that he falsified his findings in order to try and support his.
What?
I know. We're back to the bad science stuff again, aren't we?
I believe
I've
something,
got an idea.
therefore it must be true, and I will make it be true.
Yes, I will falsify accounts and commit fraud in order to make it true. Yeah. And unfortunately, some of his ideas carried weight and water right up until you and I were at school. So, yes. But what was interesting is that special education, whilst it initially focused on like medically diagnosing what these kids made them, what made these kids different from their peers, it started to change. And I again, I'm presupposing another episode. I will go into this in much greater detail. Things like the Warnock Report, the 1981 Education Act, and kind of that shift towards integrating disabled kids more towards mainstream schools. Although, having said that, it wasn't until the 1996 Education Act that local authorities were basically told, you have to do this. Lots of them were doing it before, but anyway. But they started setting up this kind of formal process to ensure that you can actually get support for kids where it was needed. And although this approach was heavily influenced by outdated beliefs in children's abilities, to be fixed, to be measurable, to be all that kind of thing, which is, unfortunately, I think, a mindset that still lingers, certainly in the British education system, the idea that people's abilities are fixed and measurable. It means that we end up focusing on what disabled children can't do instead of what their capabilities are.
Yes, so that you're not playing to people's strengths as such, are you? Really?
No, precisely.
Again, it's a disablest society. We're not enabling people.
No. I ended up going and doing a bit of data digging with the Department for Education and a couple of other sort of government statistics websites, because
I can't believe that.
I know. I had a question to ask, and I like data. Because that actually suggests there's an increase in segregating disabled students, which I kind of find ironic given the various laws supporting more inclusive education. I think part of this is linked to stuff like Joey's talked about in the past with his experience of dyslexia, is kind of insufficient training for mainstream teachers. There's a failure to address bullying because of disability. There's more demanding curriculums, and functionally there are budget cuts. And I was about to say structural changes in schools, but we don't talk about structure in schools because of RAC and the fact they're all falling apart because we decided to build all our schools out of meringue. For anyone outside the UK who didn't get that reference, bubbly concrete. Aerated concrete was used in a lot of schools between the 50s and 80s.
I'm just catching up. It's very late.
Yes, indeed. Anyway, so I think some of this situation has actually been made worse by sort of increasing mental health issues, but also kind of on the flip side, better recognition of things like neurodiversity among young people. There's also sort of heightened competition. There's financial struggles because we're all struggling with the cost of living. And I think often the approaches that focus on the more punitive measures rather than kind of like building relationships and those sort of better emotional understandings, it does mean that disabled people face higher suspension and exclusion rates. But what I find really interesting is that it also impacts particularly on those from a Black and minority ethnic background, and that sort of intersectionality between the two. The data was scary, and I had to stop reading it at that point because it was making me upset.
It's awful, isn't it? It always comes down to splitting and dividing people, and you know, that's what we're good at. That's what we've been told should happen, and it's just so disappointing to see it time and time again. It really is.
So yeah, I mean the data I found showed that there was a significant increase in segregated education from 1967 through to 1977, which was spurred on by the 1970 Education Acts that kind of universalized more things. There was a slight decline from the 1977 to the mid-90s with the 96 Education Act. And then in the early 2000s, there was a much steeper decline, probably from policies, which promoted mainstreaming, inclusive education, New Labour's policies on that kind of stuff. And in fact, by 2008, Labour had completely reversed the policy of segregation. And there was sort of the massive growth we've seen since then is playing politics here, largely down to Tory policies, reversals, and various government actions to bleed the education system dry. I try not to be overly political on this podcast, but unfortunately in this case, there's no other way of putting it. It's higher education. I know quite a lot about higher education because, went to university. I've been in and around the NUS for some years. And disabled people face some real challenges at university. They're nearly 3 times more likely than their non-disabled peers to not have any qualifications. So just think about it like this. Only a quarter of disabled people between 21 and 64 have a degree. But the number for non-disabled people is well over 40%. That's quite a big gap. When it comes to things like extra support, only about 29% of disabled students actually receive the disabled students allowance. That's the thing that actually enables me to even go to university in the first place. And it's a really useful and important thing. It's a helping hand for undergraduates and postgraduate students. It offers up to £25,000 a year, and that can go towards things that actually make a difference, like specialist equipment or, a British Sign Language interpreter or someone to take notes or covering extra travel costs that come with having a disability. And that kind of support can be a real game changer, but it seems not enough students are actually getting the chance to access it and use it.
That's really awful. I don't know if I think I might have had my microphone muted for a little while.
I think you possibly did.
Damn, I was commenting vehemently at how awful a lot of what you were saying was. I think it's terrible that we sort of disable people so much instead of enabling them. And, it is right. It comes down to people deciding that we can't afford these things and we can. It's simple as that.
Yeah, precisely.
Milking money off for other reasons. Anyway.
But yes, we've been talking for quite some time, and like I say, so Disabled History Month this year is focusing more on youth and children. I will actually get my History of Dyslexia episode out this month, and we're also hoping to get our friend Danny on to talk about university life and adjustments they're trying to get made, and I'm really looking forward to that.
Sounds excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. But yes, so I think I've rattled on for more than long enough. And as you can probably hear, even with the marvel of editing, my voice is definitely not up to its usual.
Yes,
well, just not up to its usual. So I think I will say thank you to Sam for joining me.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
And I shall say thank you so much for listening. And I hope you have a great weekend. Bye for now.
Bye. I'll tell you what. I can be a fucking moron at times.
Oh dear.
I'm just chewing some ice, but all will be revealed.
Did you try and taste extremely hot fruit and burn your tongue?
No, worse.
What did you do?
I had the thermometer in the oven,
and then you licked the thermometer.
I put it in my mouth. The whole thing. I was like, it proper went as well. I was like. And that was after removing it and trying to scrape it off with my fingers and going, oh, that's hot. And then went, oh, what's a really good idea here then is put it in your mouth.
Oh, for goodness sake.
I know, you couldn't write it. And then I touched it again. I was putting it down. At that point, I was just like, you deserve this.
Did nobody teach you hot things burn?
Apparently not. Or,
Dear,
I mean, I know they did, and I have learnt it before, but apparently it's not sunk in yet. So there we go. So yes, the crumble looks very good.
And the dish ran away with the spoon.